As with any development of a certain thing, music history is not linear. We haven't simply passed through phases, rejecting entirely the ideas of the past in favor of each new trend, so we retain elements from almost every musical period in the compositions of today. Specifically, when one wishes to write a song, they can call on any number of musical ancestors to inform them about how to set those words to music. Let's begin in ancient Greece with the epitaph of Sikolos. This is a clear example of music being set to poetry with an emphasis on poetic rhythm that informs the contour of the melody. In short, surviving Greek music very clearly puts important words on stressed beats and less important words in the spaces between. Now, this practice is so common in music today that it's almost difficult to think of music being written any other way, right? So let's dig a little deeper. Each line begins with a rising leap and then gently cascades down towards the end of the phrase. Listen. This balance in melody is mirrored within the text, both in shape as well as content. Burkholder and Company state in A History of Western Music that, quote, "The text balances extremes, counseling us to be lighthearted even while acknowledging death," unquote. Greek music used the rhythm of the poetry to inform how the rhythm of the song should go. And while we can assume this was a new idea at the time, that has been a reigning principle in almost all text settings since. This type of balance between text, melody, and expression, as well as the simple notion of stressed words being placed on stressed beats, is also reflected in modern music, as in the pop-punk anthem by modern band Neck Deep, entitled Gold Steps, released in 2015. The lyrics of this song also read like poetry, as most lyrics do, and they also carry a very similar message, as well as a similar treatment of the melody. Listen.
Sometimes things will bend you, but trust me, I'll be fine. 'Cause I've been moving mountains that I once had to climb. And life's not out to get you, despite the things you've been through. Because what you give is what you get, and it doesn't make sense to make do.
You'll notice that, much like in the epitaph of Sikolos, the band is acknowledging the hardships of life while also delivering a message of hope and perseverance. And this is coupled with a melody that often concludes phrases on the second and third scale degree, like this. 'Cause sometimes things will bend you, but trust me, you'll be fine. 'Cause I've been moving mountains that I once had to climb. And life's not out to get you, despite the things you've been through. 'Cause what you give is what you get, and it doesn't make sense to make do. Only when the message is ready to be driven home at the very end does the melody finally arrive back at the tonic. This open-ended contour of the melody, matching the phrasing found in the lyrics, is exactly why these two songs go hand in hand. Moving on to medieval Europe, where the Christian church reigns supreme. Music was used as a vessel to bring people into the church and closer to God, specifically in the Mass and the Roman liturgy, and it mirrored popular music of the time. This was because it wasn't really necessary for the music to help convey the message of Christ. The text did that on its own. Music was more so the spoonful of sugar that made going to church fun, as well as a creative outlet for composers who were employed by the church in later years. Burkholder and Company write, quote, "Singing psalms was seen as a practice that used the pleasure of music to discipline the soul, turn the mind to spiritual things, and build the Christian community," unquote. This 2-for-1 deal, or 3-for-1 deal, still exists in modern Christian rock, sometimes to the extent that the message of Christ is obscured entirely. A good example of this is in Reliant K's Be My Escape from 2004.
Gotta get out of here. I'm stuck inside this rut that I fell into by mistake. Gotta get out of here. And I'm begging you, I'm begging you, I'm begging you to be my escape. Giving up on
Now, up until very recently, I personally had no idea that the escape the band is singing about is actually redemption through Jesus Christ. At the surface, the punk rock track appears to be a love song, and nowhere in the song are there any overtly religious messages. But, as it turns out, the K in the band's name stands for King, referring once again to the Christian God. Only with the context of their other music, or perhaps a quick Google search, would one guess the underlying message of that popular song. This is similar to how St. Augustine writes about the seductive pleasure of music as a danger to those who perform it, lamenting that sometimes he is, quote, moved more by a song than by what is sung, unquote. All this to say, if the listener is able to differentiate the text from the music so severely that the comprehension of each in turn gives rise to such contrasting emotions, it's fair to say that the music and the text have nothing whatsoever to do with each other, which stands in quite stark contrast to the traditions of ancient Greece. Furthermore, as tropes and sequences came into fashion, these were more so creative outlets for composers and less part of the actual liturgy, meaning that the existing chants that inspired these were simply skeletons and molds for composers to live out their musical fantasies. An excellent example of this is Wipo of Burgundy's Victimae Paschale Laudes. This is the origin for what is now known as the Dies Irae motive. Take a listen. This small melody has become so separated from its text that it now survives as only music. This theme heralds death and destruction and is everywhere from Berlioz's Symphonie Fantastique to the soundtrack of the popular movie The Nightmare Before Christmas. The scene that this song accompanies is a peculiar montage of the citizens of Halloween Town having their go at providing Christmas for all the little children around the world. Being that this holiday is obviously not their specialty, chaos ensues, and composer Danny Elfman's use of this theme of death and destruction is quite appropriate, and it never once gives away the staunchly religious origins of the tune. After the medieval period came the Renaissance, an explosion of ideas and invention with a simultaneous renewed interest in the ancient Greek values of humanism, communication, clarity, and natural beauty. This new interest in naturalism showed up everywhere in the arts, from Brunelleschi's invention of single-point perspective, which allowed artists greater depth of field so they could create three-dimensional looking works, to Da Vinci's strikingly realistic faces you can see on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. It also cropped up in compositions of the time, where medieval composers had seen music as simply decoration for text. Renaissance musicians saw an opportunity to once again unite music and text for the common goal of emotional expression. After such a lengthy period of separation, Renaissance composers eventually arrived again at the Greek ideal of the arts simply being better together. Enter Josquin des Prez, the earliest example we have of text depiction, a full melding together of musical movement and textual communication. In Mille Regrets, he uses, quote, descending lines in all voices at words like painful distress, regrets, and my days will soon dwindle away, unquote, to illustrate the downtrodden ideas of the words. This idea gained plenty of traction further on into the Renaissance, where composers like Orlando de Lassus took it to great extremes. In his La Nuit froide et sombre, every line has an accompanying illustrative phrase. The song opens with the image of a cold, dark night, suggested in the music by longer note durations and flatter harmonies. As the sun begins to rise, the soprano rises strikingly above the other voices, decorating the music like the tapestry of the sky. This type of singing what you're saying certainly doesn't stop there, as the practice became ubiquitous and remains popular even today, as exemplified in Harry Styles' 2019 pop hit Falling, released just last year. The track is a love song and makes creative use of text depiction, as he uses a recurring descending motive over the words falling again.
What am I now? What am I now? What if I'm someone I don't want around? I'm falling again, I'm falling again, I'm falling.
The melody repeatedly tumbles down an entire major sixth, to, of course, illustrate the idea of literally falling down the scale, as well as the metaphorical idea of falling in love. We'll conclude on a note that I find particularly fascinating, and that is the Petrarchan movement. In this era, composers moved beyond putting these clever musical phrases to their own words, to instead using the poems and sonnets of a popular writer who was born a few hundred years prior, Francesco Petrarca. The composer, Adrian Willer, is particularly notable for this, specifically in his Aspra Core y Selvaggio, where he matches Petrarca's harsh, clipped sounds with wide leaps and major intervals, and sets his more fluid, sweeter lines to smoother melodies comprised of semitones and minor thirds. The text itself is poetry, and when set to music that reflects said poetry, the result is something certainly fantastic. Sound familiar? At this point in history, we have in fact come full circle back to the ideas that inspired the epitaph of Sikolos. And this familiar practice of using another's poetry in musical works is still used today, but instead of Petrarca, Shakespeare is the author of choice. In Mumford & Sons' Sigh No More, released in 2009, the band employs a myriad of illustrated melodies over lyrics made up completely of lines from William Shakespeare's Much Ado About Nothing.
Sigh no more, no more. One for 10 sea, one on shore. My heart was never pure. You know me. You know me.
You'll notice that in the line of the song, Sigh No More, the band stays in close harmony as they slide through a 1-6-4, 5, and 1-6 chord progression, which follows the verses throughout the song. This particular chord progression, inversions and all, allows each voice to continue descending down the scale, either through steps or thirds. Listen. They could have gone any direction with that really popular 1-5-1 chord progression, but instead they decided to invert it in a certain way that allows them all to just continue descending down that scale, kind of like someone who is letting loose a very large sigh. Furthermore, the Canadian rock band Marianas Trench quotes the concluding monologue of Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream when they end their album Astoria with,
"If we shadows have offended, I hope your heart can still be mended. I hope you know that I don't blame you, my dear friend. Always will love you still. But Astoria must end."
While not a direct quote all the way through, the lyrics are a play, pun intended, on the character Puck's final monologue in the show. "If we shadows have offended, think but this, and all is mended, that you have but slumbered here, whilst these visions did appear." This direct literary reference, coupled with the open-ended, ascending direction of the melody, which cleverly alludes to the inconclusive nature of dreams, would have made the composers of the Petrarchan movement proud. So what does this mean for us as musicians, and more specifically, us as music educators? Sure, it's fascinating to take this journey through music and poetry, and knowing things is honestly just straight up fun. But the study of music is more than just a collection of fun facts to spout out to your choir during rehearsal. Much like Baroque ensembles will take great care to play period and period reproduction instruments, historical knowledge should inform our performance in the same way that a 1705 handcrafted violin can faithfully sound the tones of a Vivaldi concerto. Attempting a performance without historical reference to the styles and meanings of the time would yield a similar result to getting on stage and sight-singing a musical. That is to say, flat, nonsensical, and devoid of meaningful impact on the audience. And isn't delivering that impact the very reason we take to the stage in the first place? Music is often referred to as the universal language, and it's our responsibility as music educators to provide our students, and subsequently our audiences, with an accurate translation, at which we simply cannot arrive without studying the language first and informing ourselves of the linguistic nuances of when it was first written. As teachers, we are the connection between written music and performance, and it's our duty to ensure that the music we teach, the way we teach it, and the context in which we place the pieces are all accurate, helpful, and contribute to the musical well-being of our students. Karl Polnack, formerly the director of the Boston Conservatory of Music and currently the dean at the Ithaca College School of Music, delivered this story in his welcoming address to an incoming class at the former school. Quote, "If we were a medical school, and you were here as a med student practicing appendectomies, you'd take your work very seriously, because you would imagine that some night at 2 a.m., someone is going to waltz into your emergency room and you're going to have to save their life. Well, my friends, someday at 8 p.m., someone is going to walk into your concert hall and bring you a mind that is confused, a heart that is overwhelmed, a soul that is weary. Whether they go out whole again will depend partly on how well you do your craft." Unquote. As musicians, we cannot do our craft half-heartedly for that very reason, and the execution of our craft hinges on a faithful, true, and accurate performance informed by the intent of the composer and the knowledge of the time in which it was written. If we pay attention to these details and pass them on to our students, someday at 9 p.m., our audiences will walk out whole again. Overall, the interweaving journey of text and melody has in no way been linear, and historical examples from any era could go against my assertions here. But the very fact that bits of history show up so clearly in music examples released even up to right now is astonishing, and makes me wonder what new frontier we'll traverse next. Will we enter another era of complete separation of text and music? What motive is the next Dies Irae? Who is the next Petrarch? Or the next Shakespeare? The discoveries of the past will continue to inform the practices of today, in the classroom and beyond, and only then can we move forward through our own musical history and pave the way for our students that will be studied centuries from now.